London newsagents.
Eylon, you're actually in the studio in London today, so grateful that you spared the time in a very hectic schedule, talking to most of Britain's journalists at some point or another, I'm sure.
Lewis,
grateful you came into the news
It's good to be
agents.
here, unfortunately, in such tragic circumstances, but glad to be here in person in London.
Of course, and it's good to meet you in person. We have spoken before. Let's just start with the news of the day, which is, of course, the overnight attacks by largely Western powers, but by a coalition of powers against the Houthis in Yemen to protect international shipping routes. This is an intervention you welcome, I assume.
The Houthi pirates represent a very clear threat to global trade and security, and it's important that the response is therefore global as well. They've essentially choked off shipping through the Suez Canal, forcing ships to go all the way around the Horn of Africa. That's sent up prices for consumers all around the world, with cost of living crisis that we all know in the UK no one needs any more of that. And so definitely it's good to see the UK and the US taking firm action against another Iranian proxy that is trying to destabilize the region. And it's a reminder for us of the importance of the UK-Israel alliance, because we are fighting Hamas, which is another proxy of Iran. The UK now finds itself fighting the Houthis, another proxy of Iran. And suddenly it is so clear what the breakup in global peace and security is. You have on the one side the Houthis and Hamas, who are allies. On the other side, the UK and Israel are allies. And we hope that we can stop Iran's malign and malevolent influence in the Middle East from spreading and causing any more damage.
They would say, the Houthis, that there is a very much clearer way of stopping this, which is there needs to be a ceasefire in Gaza. And if there's a ceasefire, then the attacks on shipping lanes stop.
Well, let's see what the Houthis say. The Houthis' slogan is Allahu Akbar, death to America, death to Israel, cursed be the Jews, victory to Islam.
But you would accept that there is a link between what's happening in Israel, Gaza, and what has happened in the Red Sea, that there is a link.
Oh, absolutely, because Hamas and the Houthis are both proxies of the same Iranian regime that has been trying to destabilize the very welcome process of normalization that we've seen in recent years with the peace accords with UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, with Saudi Arabia seemingly only around the corner. Iran is trying to scupper that by targeting Western targets in the region.
Well, of course, Eylon, some people would argue that Israel is doing a pretty good job by itself of scuppering that in the way that it's chosen to respond to the terrible atrocities which took place on October the 7th. And of course, in terms of, if we're thinking about the Court of International Opinion, which to some extent we are seeing play out in The Hague yesterday, today, Israel making its defence today to what we saw on Thursday by the charges laid out by South Africa. I just want to read you something that one of the lawyers for South Africa said at the International Court of Justice. They said this: "It's becoming ever clearer that huge swathes of Gaza, entire towns, villages, refugee camps are being wiped from the map. Many of them have literally been blown to pieces. On current rates which show no sign of abating, each day, 3 medics, 2 teachers, more than 1 UN employee, more than 1 journalist will be killed, many while at work, and what appears to be targeted attacks on their family homes or when they're sheltering. The risk of famine will increase each day." Particularly on that first bit there, it's becoming ever clearer that huge swathes of Gaza are being wiped from the map. What part of that is wrong?
You know, it's very sad, the levels of loss of civilian life and destruction that we are seeing, and there is a reason for that. It's not because Israel woke up one bright morning and decided to bomb Gaza. It's because on October 7th, Hamas declared war against Israel. It launched an invasion of Israel by air, land and sea, and sent in death squads with a very clear mission to burn, behead, butcher, torture, mutilate as many people as they could, as brutally as they could.
So
now, in
Israel,
response,
Israel has there's no contingency about this. Israel has no power to decide what it is doing at the moment and the manner in which it's doing it. This was all just set in motion on October the 7th, and everything was inevitable from that moment.
Well, this is the context. Hamas declared war, and in response to that, we are fighting to do 2 things. First of all, to neutralize the threat from Hamas by dismantling its military and governing machines so it can never use the Gaza Strip to attack us again, as it says it wants to do again. After committing those brutal acts of genocide on October 7th, Hamas leaders said 1 October 7th was not enough. We want to teach Israel a lesson, and we'll do it again and again and again and again. And the second thing is, of course, to fight to bring back the hostages. 136 hostages who are still trapped in the
some of whom have
Gaza
been killed
dungeons.
as a result of Israeli attacks.
Well, we know that 25 of them have been killed in captivity by Hamas, and we are fighting to bring them back.
Attacks.
There was the very tragic incident with the 3 hostages. But I just want to get back to the point about the destruction, if I may.
Yes.
Because I'm not sure people understand what Hamas did over the last 16 years in which it governed
but Eylon,
Gaza.
I don't want to get, with respect, I understand there is always, you can always choose a starting point of this, and some will say the last 16 years, some will say 1948, some will say even further back. I just want to focus on what's happened since October the 7th, which we can both agree, and I'm sure anyone listening to this will agree, were appalling unspeakable crimes. But the point is how Israel has responded to that, which has been in your gift. And very often when you and other Israeli spokespeople that I interview and other people interview, you talk as if this is entirely inevitable, that a situation and a series of events was basically begun on that day, and Israel just had to respond in the way it did. No, you didn't. You could have chosen to respond in different ways. Of course you want to attack Hamas. Well, what you don't need to do is kill over 20,000 Palestinians, surely. People in Gaza, many of whom will be innocent.
It's tragic and it's painful, and it's tragic to think that everyone who has been killed.
Eylon,
Lewis,
because
it is
surely
very
if it
painful.
were, your government wouldn't be doing it.
Lewis, I don't know whether any government in the world, having suffered the bloodiest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, the deadliest terror attack since 9/11, an armed invasion by air, land and sea, would say we're simply going to abandon hostages in the hands of that terror regime and leave it in power to attack us again, as it tells us it wants to do again and again. Our war has two very clear goals, and that's to destroy Hamas and bring back the hostages. Now, as for the level of destruction that we're seeing in Gaza, again, there's an address for that. Hamas, that spent the last 16 years deliberately embedding its military infrastructure underneath civilian areas. Of the 1,500 tunnel shafts that we found, for example, most of them have been in schools, hospitals, even UN facilities. Of course, the UN saying nothing about that. And of course, this war can end tomorrow. This war can end tomorrow if Hamas surrenders, lays down its arms, hands over the hostages. But if anyone thinks that we're going to abandon those vulnerable hostages,
no one would suggest that. No one would suggest that.
Well, some people,
but the way in which you've responded.
No, Lewis, but I want to stop, because these measures that South Africa is trying to take to the International Criminal Court of Justice are trying to make it impossible for Israel to exercise its legal obligations to defend its people in the wake of such atrocities.
No, but that is not true. What South
they
Africa,
are literally
what
asking
South Africa,
for an injunction
what
to
South
stop
Africa,
the hostilities.
The point of is that what South Africa is saying, and I don't want to get distracted before we even go down that road about South Africa as a player. I want to concentrate on what they're saying, the content of what they're saying, rather than the character. The point of what they're saying is that, yes, October the 7th was appalling. We can all agree on that.
Well, South Africa didn't say that, actually. Because,
no. But the reason that
South Africa didn't say that.
But Eylon, the reason they didn't say that is because in terms of genocide, it doesn't matter what happened on October the 7th. Genocide is absolute. So if it is the case that your state is committing genocide in Palestine, it doesn't matter what happened on October the 7th. It is no justification. So that is the point of what South Africa is saying. And that is why, actually, as appalling as it was, what happened on October the 7th is not germane to what is happening in terms of genocide, in terms of what is happening in Gaza now, and what your state is doing.
This is absolutely critical for understanding the context of the defensive
There's
action
no context to genocide, and I'm not saying that you are committing genocide, because it's not for me to say that. But if it were to be the case that your state is committing genocide, context is actually irrelevant.
Which we are not. No, because I have to push back on that. In response to the Hamas acts of genocide on October 7th, Israel has been launching a campaign to destroy the Hamas military machine. By the way, a campaign that right at the beginning, after October 7th, world leaders around the world said was entirely justified, because the only way to stop Hamas...
They're not saying that now,
repeating, I heard Oliver Dowden, the Deputy Prime Minister, just 2 weeks ago saying we must eradicate Hamas.
Lord Cameron, the Foreign Secretary, said just the other day that he's concerned, or has been worried, that international humanitarian law may have been broken by your government.
Lord Cameron said a minute earlier that according to the information he has from Foreign Office lawyers, there have been no breaches of international law.
The point is not the fact that you responded, Eylon. No one who is right-thinking would at all criticise Israel for responding to the appalling abuses that took place on your citizens. The point is the manner in which you've responded and the proportionality. The former Pentagon intelligence analyst Mark Galasco has said to find a similar density of high explosives used in a small populated area, we might have to go back to the Vietnam War, when some 20,000 tons of bombs were dropped on Hanoi. Now, leaving aside whether we think this is actually going to realise your aims, which is deliver security to Israel, and if we're making the comparison with the Vietnam War, we can see it didn't do much for the United States, dropping over 20,000 tons of explosives on a tiny area. That is the point, that the proportionality is not proximate to what happened. And we can see that in terms of the casualties as well. Over 20,000 Palestinians dead in just 3 months.
Of whom how many are militants?
Well, we don't know that, but your contention surely you would accept that many civilians have died and been wounded and been maimed. And that is to leave aside the wider humanitarian situation.
Many civilians have been hurt. We know that 8,000 Hamas terrorists have been killed. When you look at that ratio of civilian to combatant ratio and you compare that to the UK's own wars in Afghanistan, Iraq and against ISIS, we find that in the context of counter-terrorism wars, that's very much in line and in fact exceeds the standards set by other armies. But I do want to explain this point, Lewis, before you move on to the next question. Israel spent weeks urging an evacuation of northern Gaza. And it spent weeks urging that evacuation because we do not want civilians to be hurt. We don't want them to be in harm's way. Hamas's whole strategy is based on using human shields and hiding behind civilians. Now, in order not to hurt civilians, we urged an evacuation. Notice that inherent contradiction in South Africa's argument, where it tries to claim that Israel's asking civilians to evacuate from a war zone is somehow evidence of genocide.
But they can't
intent.
evacuate from a war zone, can they, Eylon? Because they can't go anywhere. This is what is unique about this conflict. Ultimately, they can't go anywhere. It is a tiny, tiny place. 85% of the population has been displaced. 85%. I can't think of a war where there would be anything remotely comparable to that.
Lewis, Hamas spent 16 years building its
Never mind
military
Hamas.
infrastructure.
I'm
No,
just
not never mind
concentrating-
Hamas.
No, it is
Lewis,
important,
not never
Eylon,
mind
because
Hamas.
this is what you do. You always engage in whataboutery.
No,
now,
Lewis.
Hamas are terrible, terrible people. I will be the first to say that. I never, ever, and I don't think anyone right-thinking would defend them. But surely we must hold your government to a higher standard than these butchers.
Lewis, this isn't a question about whataboutism. This is a fact that Hamas built a military machine, and those targets are legitimate military targets. In order to reach those
20,000
military targets, in order to reach the military facilities that it built under homes, schools and hospitals, we need civilians to get out of harm's way. Here's what we've done. Can I tell you what we've done to get civilians out of harm's way? First of all, we spent 3 weeks urging an evacuation of northern Gaza before we moved in. As part of that, we placed 70,000 phone calls to Palestinians urging them to leave. We dropped 7 million leaflets, 14 million text messages, and 14 million voice messages as well. We secured a humanitarian corridor for people to be able to leave. We established a humanitarian zone and said, here is an area where Hamas is not operating. We think civilians should go there and the UN should set up tents. Now, the situation is so topsy-turvy that the UN then condemns us for designating a humanitarian zone. We are trying to keep civilians protected. And we are fighting against a cynical enemy that is trying to use them as human shields. And unfortunately,
and so your moral obligation, if you're right, Hamas terrible people, they use people as human shields. So your moral obligation to those people is discharged just because Hamas, who you accept are terrible, terrible people, are using people as human shields.
No,
so you're
Lewis.
outsourcing your moral faculties to Hamas.
Not in the least. Our obligations are to continue to wage this war against Hamas, which it started in accordance with international law.
You mentioned the UN
and the principles.
as you know.
Well, Lewis, you asked me a question, and I'm trying to answer
Well, I know, but
it.
you've answered it fully. You mentioned the UN. As you know, the UN Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs has says Gaza has simply become uninhabitable. This is the other question, which is it's not just about the bombs that you're dropping and the attacks that you're making. It's in terms of whether Gazans can live. I mean, is there enough food in Gaza right now?
Well, at the moment we have excess capacity at the Israeli crossings in order to allow more food into Gaza. We've been saying for weeks, anyone who wants to see more aid going into Gaza should simply send more food. We're now seeing, in fact, twice as many food trucks going into Gaza.
Why doesn't
before
Israel
the
send
war.
more then?
Why don't we send war?
Send food, yeah.
Into enemy-run territory as we are coming under rocket attacks and there are hostages in there who are being starved?
So you're happy, basically, that innocent Gazans starve just because maybe some of that food might end up in the mouths of Hamas
Lewis,
fighters.
Under international law, there is absolutely no obligation for a party that is at war with another party to supply it provisions.
I thought you weren't at war with the Palestinian people.
We are at war with
at war
Hamas, which governs the Gaza
same.
Strip. Our obligation under international law is to facilitate the delivery of aid necessary for the survival of the civilian population. That is what we are doing. And I don't recall any war in history in which one party to a war has sent civilians on the other side aid. By the way, that is what we are doing by streaming water into the Gaza Strip, electricity that went into the Gaza Strip as well. Unfortunately, the same electricity that was used in order to perpetrate these attacks against us on October 7th.
But this is your problem at the ICJ, which is that you are leaving yourself open to the accusation, which many people would say has credibility, that you are starving an entire people, and a people that ultimately you are responsible for.
No, Lewis, these accusations are completely without any factual or legal
80% of
basis.
Gazans have no food.
Why don't they have food?
Well, for a start, you are not sending in, and you are not allowed, and you are
I'm sorry,
consistently,
Lewis.
you're consistently critiqued for not allowing enough humanitarian
I'm sorry,
trucks
Lewis.
to get into the Gaza
You're
Strip,
not
as
sending
you know.
food to Yemen. That doesn't mean you're not That doesn't mean you are starving Yemen. Israel has no obligation under international law
have no
to
obligation.
send food. Send food? No. Our
you've been
obligation
very
under
clear.
international law is to facilitate the delivery. That is why we have more than double the capacity to let more aid trucks in. And if you would like more food to go into Gaza, and we certainly hope more aid will reach civilians in Gaza, you should send it. What we think is outrageous is that the UN has not said a word about how Hamas has been hijacking that aid. We have videos of Hamas terrorists hijacking food trucks, and unfortunately UN officials have not a word of condemnation to say about that. And we hope people, by the way, Lewis, you speak about the UN with a great deal of moral admiration.
I didn't really. I'm citing what they've said. I mean,
as an authority, we hope people understand how poorly served they are by international officials who are trying to cover up the fact that they are covering up for Hamas.
Right. So you think the UN is in league with Hamas? That's your position.
We think that there is a very serious problem of complicity.
Right, okay.
Well, I'll give you an example.
No, I just want to move on because we haven't got that much more time. You've made your point. One of the other claims. Well, you have. Well, the other claim.
I haven't, but we can move on.
All right, okay. One of the other claims from South Africa is that genocide and hatred, and genocidal speech and hatred, has become embedded in the Israeli state, and that we've heard that from senior Israeli politicians, that hatred towards Palestinians has become normalized. Would you deny that?
I don't think that you should judge a country by angry remarks made by certain politicians in a time of war. I'm old enough to remember when President Obama spoke of ISIS as being a cancer. No one took that as being evidence of genocidal intent. On the contrary, the Prime Minister, the Defense Minister...
You wouldn't equate ISIS with the Palestinian people.
I would equate ISIS with Hamas, absolutely.
Okay, but, I mean, for example...
the Prime Minister, the Defense Minister and the War Cabinet have been very clear, both in word and in deed, that the Palestinian people are not our enemy. And we hope for the day that we can live in peace and prosperity with them as neighbours, the day after Hamas. But no matter how we want to achieve peace, that's not possible while they are governed by a terror organisation whose sole rationale is the murder of Jews and the destruction of our country.
Yoav Gallant said we are fighting human animals, we'll eliminate everything,
yes.
They will regret it.
Yes,
your Prime Minister evoked a biblical analogy referring to the Israelites' enemy. You must remember what Amalek has done to you.
Let me respond to the Defense
Major
Minister's
General
remarks.
Ghassan Alan, there will be no electricity, no water in Gaza. There will only be destruction. You wanted hell. You will get hell. I mean, and you wonder why it is that a state like South Africa, which frankly has its own history of difficult human rights violations, is in a position to be able to turn around and say they want these people dead. Your own government is saying it.
The Defense Minister called the Hamas death squads who invaded Israel, raped little girls, tortured and mutilated children, dismembered them human animals. And we think it's disgusting that South Africa and a whole panoply of human rights organizations are angrier that we called people who dismembered little children human animals than about the dismembering of those children themselves.
We have Feiglin, the founder of Israel's right-wing party,
he is an irrelevant
he's
individual.
Called for the complete destruction of Gaza, but you can see that there is an atmosphere which is developed.
I'm sorry, Lewis. He is not even a member of parliament. He is an irrelevant fringe figure who is not even an elected official. The elected officials and the government of Israel have been clear in word and in deed that the people of Gaza are not our enemy.
But it isn't just these people. I mean, you will know, for example, a group of prominent Israelis, and these include some of Israel's top scientists, the Royal Society member, Professor David Harel, academics, diplomats, former members of the Knesset. They themselves have said, not me saying this, that there is extensive and blatant incitement to genocide and ethnic cleansing in Gaza by influential public figures. They said that in a letter to your country's Attorney General and state prosecutors, and they demanded action to stop the normalization of language that breaks out both Israeli and international law. So it isn't just the outside world saying this, and it isn't just South Africa saying this, it's prominent Israelis saying this.
Lewis, we're talking about a war, and a war that is being waged.
So everything justifies it.
No, Lewis, I'm trying to finish my sentence. When you look at the statements of the elected officials who are running this war, I'm not talking about fringe individuals, and we have many fringe individuals who will say many strange things. Just as Britain, there are many fringe individuals who will say strange things. We have made clear the Palestinian people are not our enemy. Hamas is our enemy. The human animals and savages who brutally committed acts of gang rape, paedophilia and necrophilia on October 7th are our enemy. And we are fighting so that they can never hurt us again like they are promising to do, and to bring back the hostages who are being physically, psychologically and sexually tortured in the Hamas terror dungeons. And if anyone thinks that we are going to stop and simply abandon the hostages there, instead of waging this war in accordance with international law, they are sorely mistaken.
Why are so many journalists being killed in Gaza?
Well, one of the journalists who was killed recently happened to be hitching a ride with Hamas terrorists who was operating a drone. And if you have a look at that list of journalists who were killed, have you looked through the list?
I have looked at the list.
Have you? How many did you
that's
count?
From the Committee to Protect Journalists.
Exactly. On that list, how many people did you find who are listed as being Hamas-affiliated media?
There were lots of people who work for Gazan media, yes, and some
I
who work
counted
for Hamas-affiliated media.
at
But you will
least
accept
20.
that there have been journalists who've been killed who
I
do
don't
not.
think that you can be a card-carrying member of Hamas and a journalist as well. I think it would be equally preposterous to speak of ISIS-affiliated journalists being killed during the bombing campaign of Raqqa and Mosul, which, by the way, also left those cities uninhabitable.
Whether they're journalists or not, in some ways irrespective. I mean, more journalists have been killed in 3 months of Israel's war on Gaza than according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, more of all of World War II or the Vietnam War. Compare it to the Ukrainian war, which has obviously been going on for longer. 15 journalists were killed in the whole of 2022. Whether they're journalists or not, the fact that so many are dying does speak of the mass slaughter, doesn't it?
It speaks of the fact that Hamas is waging war from inside densely populated areas. Lewis, we didn't pick this battlefield. We didn't even pick this war.
No, but you're choosing the way
Lewis, we
that
don't
you prosecute
want
the war.
this
That's
war.
the point. I get that.
We don't
but you're
want
choosing
this
the way
war.
that you'll prosecute. It comes back to this
Do
constantly.
you have suggestions for... I'll pass them on. Do you have suggestions for how we should prosecute this instead?
If your military apparatus needs suggestions from elsewhere, I'm sure they can do so from
our
other
military
Western
apparatus
states.
is convinced that we're doing a darn good job under international law, waging war. By the way, Lewis,
well, if someone once said in this country, they would say that, wouldn't they?
Uniquely challenging counter-terrorism battlefield. Lewis, no army in the history of the world has had to wage war against an enemy that has spent 16 years deliberately hiding under homes, schools, universities and hospitals. No army has ever done it. We are having to come up with innovative ways to try to minimize harm to civilians despite facing an enemy that is trying to maximize them, and a chorus of UN officials who are covering that up.
Just on the journalist point, what would you say? You will have seen the case, of course, of Mr. Wael al-Dardou, who's his son, a journalist, killed in an Israeli strike. Al Jazeera bureau chief there, his wife Anna, his grandchild, his 15-year-old son, 7-year-old daughter, all killed since October. I mean, again, that speaks to the absolute slaughter that's going on. That's one family.
Lewis.
You must hear that and be appalled, surely.
Lewis, war is awful.
And so there we go. That's it.
No, Lewis, war is awful and we want this war to end. But we need this war to end in a way that makes sure that Hamas can't attack us again. Because if we do not destroy Hamas, the consequence of inaction is going to be that it will slaughter our people again like it did on October 7th. Now, we are facing a uniquely challenging battlefield that no army in the history of the world has dealt with. And we're doing a stellar job trying to adhere to the principles of proportionality, precaution, and distinction. Would there be any
civilian death toll that would be too high for you and for your government?
The civilian death toll is already high. And that is why we have been calling the hurt in this war is intolerable.
But you could, you could eliminate every Palestinian on the Gaza Strip. That would clearly be
Lewis, that would be outrageous.
No, but of course it would be outrageous. So what's the point? What's the level?
I think it's appalling of you to even suggest that.
Well, I'm trying to explore the logic of what your government is saying. I'm trying to explore what point is the collateral damage, to use that terrible phrase, is it too great? Or is there no point to achieve your military objectives?
Is that we are going after Hamas military infrastructure in accordance with the principles of international law.
Until you decide enough is enough.
Well, we set a test for when this war can end. We called it the diplomat babysitter test. This war will end when the diplomats at the United Nations who voted to save the skin of the Hamas terror regime would feel safe taking responsibility to babysit children in Kfar Aza, in Be'eri and near Oz. Because our children have a right to sleep in their beds without being slaughtered. We don't think that's too much to ask for. We think it's basic humanity and basic human rights. And in order for that to happen, the Hamas terror regime cannot be their neighbor. You know, Lewis, we're in this situation now because for many years Israel tried to do everything not to have this conflict. When there were calls in Israel that said, topple Hamas, destroy it now, we didn't do it because we knew that the cost of war would be unbearably high. But we're in this war now.
Israel didn't do absolutely everything it could have done, did it? In the sense that what Israel could have done is to try and generate and sustain a permanent political solution. And your Prime Minister is on the record as saying,
Lewis,
I am
Hamas
proud.
doesn't want...
I am proud that I prevented the establishment of a Palestinian state. That is what your Prime Minister said.
Lewis.
So the idea that Israel has done everything it could to ensure there is a settlement in the Middle East is preposterous.
Hamas does not want a political solution. Hamas wants the final solution. Hamas is an internationally prescribed terrorist organization that openly states its genocidal intentions against Jews and against the people of Israel. And we are dealing with a territory that is governed by a terrorist organization that the UK certainly prescribes as a terrorist organization. It isn't possible, Lewis, to reach political settlement with an army of terror that thinks brutally gang raping a woman and then chopping off her breast and playing with it like a football at the Nova Festival. That is not an organization with which you can reach a political settlement. We very much hope, Lewis, that one day we will be able to reach a permanent negotiated settlement with our Palestinian neighbors. In order for that to happen, we're going to have to see the Palestinians accept that the state of Israel is here to exist and is here to stay.
And so you would like to see a Palestinian state? Your government, your Prime Minister?
The Prime Minister has said we think the Palestinians should have all the rights to govern themselves and none of the powers to threaten us. Now, I'll tell you what
so it's funny.
conversations...
Israel's always in the position where it gets to set all of the terms in all of this, isn't it? You decide when the war ends. You decide what sort of state they have. You decide when the settlement can happen and when it can't. I mean, do these people not have rights to self-determination in their own terms, Eylon?
Lewis, Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip in 2005. We gave the Palestinians the keys to Gaza and said, we want to see you build an economically and politically prosperous area here. And what we got in response was not only 20 years of rocket fire, but death squads that perpetrated the deadliest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. One question that many Israelis will be asking, because this isn't a hypothetical seminar, this is literally life and death for us, is that the West Bank is a mountain range that overlooks Tel Aviv and surrounds Jerusalem. Not only would rocket fire from there give you 20 seconds to run for shelter, not 90 seconds as in the Gaza Strip, the risk now is of the sort of appalling slaughter that we saw on October 7th on a much larger scale. We want there to be peace with the Palestinians. For that to happen, they can't keep hearing people on the streets of London chanting from the river to the sea, because that tells them you don't need to compromise. You don't need to accept that the state of Israel has a right to exist and it's here to stay, because you can continue indulging these dreams of violent struggle.
Right, so Palestinian statehood is not only dependent on what Gazans or Palestinians do in Gaza and the West Bank, it's even dependent on what happens in London and happens in capitals of the West. That's how contingent Palestinian statehood might be.
Well, the question of how we achieve a secure peace with the Palestinians is based on the other side's commitment to genuinely achieving a secure peace.
I'm conscious
the
of
problem
that. So just one more questions about
Sure.
the ICJ, if you don't mind. If the ICJ were to rule against you in the preliminary round, the actual eventual conclusions may take many years, but in terms of their preliminary assessment, will you comply with their stipulations?
We fully expect the ICJ to throw out this spurious claim.
No, but if they don't, will
I'm
you
not going to
comply?
answer absurd hypotheticals.
It's not an absurd hypothetical. It's either
Lewis,
yes or no.
It is an
could easily
absurd
happen.
hypothetical, because when you have parents sitting in that courtroom whose children were abducted and being held as hostages, the idea that an international court of justice that is supposed to uphold international law might actually order those parents to stop fighting to bring back their children.
So you'll adhere to a court judgment if they rule your way.
It's an
what
absurd
kind of
hypothetical.
kangaroo court would that be?
It's an absurd hypothetical.
Why are you even signatories to the convention if you are unwilling to commit to abide by the means by which that convention is policed and enforced? What is the point?
Lewis, the State of Israel was one of the first signatories to the Genocide Convention, because the crime of genocide was
so I would have
defined-
thought that the State of Israel would be the first to say that they would want to see that court stipulations are adhered to for precisely the
State of
reason
Israel
you are
would
referring
like to see international law being applied fairly, understanding that to
in
the
the way
extent...
that Israel wants.
No, in a way that understands that on October 7th, we were the victims of an act of genocide, and we are now exercising our inherent right
And
under
Hamas is not a
international
signatory
law.
to the convention. That is why they are not in court, because they are not a state, as you often
No,
fond of
instead
saying,
it has
and
South
because they are
Africa
not a-
acting as its legal arm. Tragically, we think it is
What
very
on earth
sad.
does that mean? Just
Well,
engage.
South Africa.
Have you ever heard of the phrase of playing the actual issue rather than the man?
South Africa is playing advocate for the devil. South Africa, which has aligned itself with Russia and China and Iran, the same South Africa that invited Iran, which backs the Houthi rebels, to be part of the BRICS, has decided to throw its lot in with Iran.
What do you think it
and,
says?
and
for,
Hamas.
What do you think
and
it
on
says,
October 8th,
what do you think it
Lewis, will
says
you
from
ask me a
Israel?
question?
What do you think it says from Israel's moral authority that you're basically saying that you will only obey what a court says if they agree with you? That's not how courts work. The whole of society, as you know, would dissolve into disorder and anarchy. You're basically saying international law does not matter to you.
I'm not saying that. You're putting words in my mouth.
Well, it's
what
the
I'm
logical
saying,
inference of
what
what
I'm
you're saying.
saying is that as 136 hostages are still trapped and being starved and raped in the Hamas terror dungeons, the thought that the International Court of Justice might order Israel to cease its efforts to bring them back home to safety is something so horrific that I can't even imagine.
But
that
they might
scenario.
say, for example, that they want you to ensure that there is access to see what's going on at the moment, that there are documents available to them, all of these stipulations that might enforce and help them understand what is happening. Would you not? Your government will at least accept that, surely.
Well, the state of Israel at the moment is being part of these proceedings and has presented very clearly evidence of the atrocities that Hamas perpetrated and the extensive efforts that we have made in this uniquely challenging environment to try to keep civilians safe, despite Hamas's efforts to keep them in harm's way. All that evidence was laid out in our legal team's stonking performance at the ICJ, including as part of our legal team, Professor Malcolm Shaw, who literally wrote the textbook on international law and literally wrote the International Committee of the Red Cross's suggested reading on genocide in international law.
And you're confident that Israel has obeyed international law, international humanitarian law at all times?
Yes.
Mr. Levy, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you, Lewis.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.